Our next presenter is Elin Justice, whose thesis is titled Hillbilly Talkback, Co-Creation and Counter-Narrative in Appalachia. Kat Cizek and I have had the honor and pleasure to work with Elin on her thesis these last 2 years. Elin came to CMS with a really inspiring sense of clarity and purpose, connected to her family roots in Appalachia, her experiences in media production, and her dedication to co-creation as an ethical mode of collective self-representation. Once she started writing, she made things easy for Kat and me because it just came forward. Her writing just beautifully written and beautifully conceived, and I'm just so excited to hear her present and have her share this work with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Vivek. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right. So like you've heard, the title of my thesis is Hillbilly Talkback, Co-Creation and Counter-Narrative in Appalachia. So I'd quickly just like to give an overview of what I want to talk about today. So I'll start out with my research questions and a little bit of background on why I actually chose this topic. Then going into introducing the problem itself, which is the way that Appalachia is represented in popular media. Next, I'll go into a quick breakdown of 4 common stereotypes of Appalachia that exist in popular media today. And then I want to shift into a look at my own documentary project called the Appalachian Retelling Project, and looking at how it approaches co-creation in order to create new narratives of Appalachia. And then just finish it off with some conclusions and some lessons learned from all of this. So my 3 research questions. The first is, what images have historically been used to represent Appalachia in popular media, and what do these images mean? The second is, how might co-creative documentary practices work to produce new counter-narratives of the region? And the final one is, what sorts of narratives emerge from these documentaries that use co-creative methodologies? So I'll be breaking down this presentation into 2 halves. The first half will focus on this first question of how Appalachia is currently portrayed in popular media. And the second half will focus on a case study of my own project that's attempting to challenge these representations. I did want to take a second to explain why I chose this topic, because it's actually a pretty personal topic for me. And it's something whose effects I started noticing at a really young age. So I grew up in a town called Pikeville, Kentucky, which you can see by the green star on this map, located in far eastern Kentucky, close to both the West Virginia and the Virginia borders. So really in the heart of central Appalachia, which is the white part on this map. And growing up in the region, I think you tend to become aware at a very young age that there's some sort of difference between you and those who live outside the mountains. So I would notice it when my parents and I went on vacation, that people might look at you funny when they heard you talk and they heard your accent. I also remember watching TV, and I would notice even as a kid that Appalachia was pretty frequently used either as the butt of a joke, so maybe they would call someone a hillbilly in order to imply that they were dumb. And other times I remember seeing it portrayed as this object of pity, just this place of utter destitution and helplessness. And those were the only 2 types of images that I ever saw of my home. And neither of those images captured the place that I knew. So I'm going to talk more about the broader effects of this kind of representation in a second, but there were a lot of effects that I noticed from this in my own life. I think when you hear enough times that you're not as smart or as capable or as good as everyone else, it's really hard to not start believing it. So for example, when I was 17 and I started applying to colleges and doing interviews, I remember making this very conscious effort to hide my accent because I didn't want the interviewer to hear me say 2 words and just decide that I was stupid. So I think that there's this underlying sense that we're less than or that we're looked down upon by others. And I think that these sorts of effects tend to trickle down and continue on into new generations who feel the same way. So I talked about the effects that I noticed in my own life, but as I began to do more research on this topic, I discovered that the effects were actually much deeper and more systemic than I had thought. Appalachia has been portrayed in popular media through a fairly narrow set of images for over 100 years. And all of these images add up to create this sense that Appalachia is this other space. Historian Anthony Harkins actually describes Appalachia as a place that is in but not of America. Often this is done by the media spinning what might be considered a positive cultural trait, so something like having a tight-knit family structure, into something negative, like incest. I think doing so makes it much easier for governments, organizations, and just the public at large to ignore the problems that Appalachia faces. And so issues like a higher than average poverty rate, which is exacerbated by things like periodic flooding, lack of broadband access, and inadequate infrastructure, keeping people trapped in a cycle of poverty, as well as the region's opioid epidemic continues to go unsolved. Because of the effects that I just mentioned and an overall lack of job opportunity in Appalachia, the region in the last 10 years especially has seen a large portion of its population move out of the region. This phenomenon has been called a brain drain because many of those who have left, are young people with a college degree or higher. But on the other hand, those who continue to live in the region are far more likely to struggle with and die from what's been called diseases of despair, including things like alcohol abuse, prescription and illegal drug overdose, and suicide compared to people who live elsewhere. Another effect of the way that Appalachia is represented is that Appalachia has become very equated with whiteness. Although nearly 20% of Appalachia's population is non-white and the area has become increasingly diverse since 2010, the region continues to be portrayed almost entirely through white people. What's interesting though is that author Meredith McCarroll actually argues that popular media often portrays Appalachian people using the same tropes that are used to represent people of color. She says that this marks Appalachian people as phenotypically white, yet hierarchically non-white, and she terms this categorization unwhite. I do want to emphasize here that by this term, I'm not trying to say that white Appalachian people face the same legal or systemic oppression faced by people of color, or that Appalachians are in effect some sort of racial minority. Instead, I mean to call attention to the way that the subordination of a phenotypically white Appalachia to a normal America both upholds and privileges some sort of true whiteness while simultaneously erasing the existence of people of color in Appalachia. And finally, the way that Appalachia is represented has effects on the identity and self-worth of those who live there. These were the effects that I noticed most in my own life. One study actually found that Appalachian representation has caused many in the region to form identities based upon an us-them mentality, which prevents people from uniting within and between identity groups. Also, more anecdotally, many Appalachian people speak about feeling out of place in institutions of power or just outside the region in general, which is something I have definitely personally experienced during my time at MIT. So I've discussed the effects, but how can we be sure that media representation is actually one of the causes of what's going on in Appalachia? I'm framing my argument through the work of Stuart Hall in cultural studies. Hall writes that events have no meaning until they're represented, whether that's in language, visual communication, or some other type of representation. Because of this, representation is deeply intertwined with questions of power. Hall asks the question, who has the power in what channels to circulate which meanings to whom to call attention to this relationship between representation and power? Hall also writes that meaning is a very fluid thing and that it can never be finally fixed. However, certain meanings do become privileged at different points in time through systems of ideology, which Hall defines as the frameworks of thinking and calculation about the world, the ideas with which people figure out how the social world works, what their place is in it, and what they ought to do. Dominant ideologies are perpetuated through representation, and especially media representation, because it's the principal means through which meanings are distributed in our society today. Media representation is especially important in shaping how we think about other groups of people, because a lot of times this is the only way that we actually experience these other groups. Hall writes about the way that difference is used as a signifier in media, and that images of difference are often read in broader terms of cultural belonging. Generally, the underlying message behind these images is that those who are some way different don't belong. So next, I'd like to just give a brief breakdown of 4 common tropes that I've identified that are used to portray Appalachia in popular media. I've named these degraded, violent, placeless, and white. I've broken each of these image types down into subcategories, which you can see below the headings. And in my thesis, I lay out the history of each image type, but for now, I'll just leave it by saying that each of these tropes has a very long history and representations of Appalachia. So for example, images of degraded Appalachia can actually be traced back as far as the 1700s. And then off to the side, I've given an example of either a modern or a popular example of each trope. So for degraded, we've got Hillbilly Elegy, which is a book that was a New York Times bestseller in both 2016 and 2017, and was recently turned into a film directed by Ron Howard. For violence, Deliverance, which has remained a very popular and well-known film despite being released nearly 50 years ago. For placelessness, The Beverly Hillbillies, which was a hugely popular sitcom in the 60s, and I'm pretty sure still holds the record for being the highest rated half-hour episode of television in history. And for whiteness, which I actually want to explain that I chose this for lack of a better term because I'm trying to encompass these three ideas of being white, male-dominated, and this kind of dangerous or extremist brand of Christianity. But I chose The Devil All the Time, which actually came out on Netflix last year, and it stars Tom Holland, Bill Skarsgård, Robert Pattinson, just this very well-known and popular cast. While I don't have time to show an example of all the images that I talk about in my thesis, I did want to play at least one clip to give you an idea of the kinds of images that I'm talking about. So this is an ABC special hosted by Diane Sawyer that aired in 2009. I was in 8th grade when this special came out, and I think it had a big impact on a lot of people my age. And I'm going to play the first 2 or so minutes, and you can see a lot of the imagery that is very common in representing Appalachia. And let me know if you can't hear this.
Tonight on 2020, a Diane Sawyer special.
In the deep dark hills of eastern Kentucky.
Travel inside a world apart.
That's the place where I traced my bloodline.
Into the creeks and steep hollows of the oldest mountains in America. Home to the descendants of pioneers, driven by their dreams to claw through these dangerous passes and create an American continent. They are brave, tough, wary of outsiders, steeped in family and faith. They are also America's legendary fighters.
On a proportionate basis, the Appalachian population has lost more men and women in America's wars than any other part of the American nation.
So how is it so many of these people have been left behind? We take you tonight to one of the poorest regions in the nation, where men and women die younger than other Americans, where there's a documented epidemic of drug addiction, cancer, toothlessness, alcoholism, depression.
Where the sun comes up about 10 in the morning and the sun goes down about 3 in the day.
And yet every
Pause that there. So now that we've looked at some of the common harmful ways that Appalachia is represented in media, I want to turn to the second half of my research, which focuses on how to create new representations of Appalachia that challenge these old stereotypes. So first, I'd quickly like to return to Stuart Hall's work in representation. Like I mentioned before, Hall writes that the meaning of an image can never be finally fixed. And he uses the phrase politics of the image to describe this ongoing struggle for any particular meaning to be dominant. Because meaning can never be finally fixed, this opens up space to create counter-representations, which challenge the current regime of representation around a certain topic or group. Hall offers 3 potential strategies to challenge a dominant regime of representation, but for the sake of time, I'll just talk about the third one, which he refers to as going inside the image. This means that you actually focus on the stereotypes themselves that are used to portray a group, and you try to complicate what that stereotype means and how it came to exist in the first place. Hall says that this third strategy is the most effective, not only at creating new images of a group, but of actually challenging the way that they're represented altogether. But in addition to studying counter narratives, I'm also really interested in how co-creation and co-creative documentary specifically can work to produce these counter narratives. To give a sort of broad definition of what co-creation is, William Uricchio and Kat Cizek define it as an alternative to the single authorship model that's common in media production, and it refers to a constellation of frameworks and production methods rather than one specific methodology. Co-creation also allows projects to emerge from within communities and often involves a wide variety of perspectives. It requires deep listening on the part of everyone involved, and usually the final project isn't defined at the outset, but rather evolves out of this process of listening and discovery. Co-creation also seeks to challenge the power dynamics that come with traditional modes of media production. Cizek and Uricchio write that co-creation seeks to decolonize the systems that oppress and stimulate projects that don't simply document or passively observe the world, but insist on change. So for these reasons, I was really interested in seeing how this type of methodology that seeks to level power imbalances could work to produce new narratives of Appalachia that would challenge the way that it's currently represented. Although in my thesis, I look at 2 case studies of co-creative documentaries set in Appalachia, for the sake of time, I just want to talk about one, which is my own project. I started the Appalachian Retelling Project in July of 2020, and it's a web-based participatory documentary that aims to challenge stereotypes of Appalachia through collective storytelling. So participants can submit written, video, photo, audio, or other content to me on nearly any topic related to life in Appalachia that I will then post on the website. I provide prompts online to get people to think about stories from their own lives or the lives of their family and community that might act as a counter narrative of Appalachia. And although these prompts cover several different subject areas, they all tie back to a general theme, which is, what is a story about Appalachia that you haven't seen in mainstream media? To start off the project and to give people an idea of the types of stories that I was looking for, I recorded 5 short-form documentary videos that I released on the website throughout the last week of July. Each video featured a different Appalachian person who spoke about a different topic that was supposed to act as a counter-narrative. So I want to show this video now, which is actually a trailer that I made for the project to try to get more people to submit. But it also features some clips from my initial interviews and also some of the stories that were submitted, just so you can get a kind of general sense of the project.
I had a story I wanted to tell. Oh, yes, I want to tell a story that defines what Appalachia is, and I'd like to tell that.
There's kind of this analogy that I like to use. There's like these 2 mountains, and one mountain is the official narrative, and this other mountain you have is the vernacular history, is the oral history. And in the middle, like here in Appalachia, that's where the holler's at, where the 2 mountains meet. And that's also where you find the most biodiversity, is in the holler.
If we want to paint Eastern Kentucky as this, like, whatever the media does, you know, uneducated or whatever kind of people, I don't think that it's fair to do that, because I think 99% of people are really, really great.
I have seen a lot in the media of how Appalachia is portrayed, and it's wrong. It's not what we are, it's not how we live.
Telling the story of a white male place filled with lazy white males impacts policy. It erases women, it erases people of color.
I think it's important to reimagine Appalachia, right? We've had one narrative for a long time, and honestly, it sort of like cheats the region of all of its complexities, right? All of the nuances, like we don't have to be just one thing.
There are so many people with amazing stories about resilience and stories about what the region does well without romanticizing it, but without painting it as a place that has given up. I think it would paint a truer picture of the region and a picture that would actually help.
So some aspects of this project that were co-creative. I'm actually dividing my approach into two categories. The first is co-creation between myself as a media maker with the Appalachian community. And the second is co-creation as a member of the Appalachian community myself, because I do think that being Appalachian affected how I approached this project in ways that it might not have if I'd been from somewhere else. So to summarize my approach to co-creation with the community, I began asking for feedback from people in the community very early on as I started this project. My original idea was that the only way to participate would be through video, so kind of continuing with the trend of the original videos that I had made. But I got a lot of feedback that most people wouldn't be comfortable either with speaking on camera or doing these like selfie style videos or just making their own videos in general. So I started to adjust my approach to allow people to contribute in whichever way they felt most comfortable. And I eventually decided to just open it up to basically any media format, so including written stories, photos, and videos. The submissions process is definitely the most participatory aspect of this project. I opened the project to submissions the first week of August 2020, and it's been open ever since. So like I said, people can submit in any media format that they want, but they can also speak about pretty much any topic that they want, as long as it's related to Appalachia in some way and it doesn't violate our community standards. I provide a list of prompts on the website to get people thinking about potential topics to write about. So a couple of examples are, how have you or someone you know found fulfillment in this region when the media tells us that in order to be successful, we have to leave? And what's an example of a portrayal of Appalachia in media that got it wrong? What was wrong about it and how could it be better? These questions are supposed to get people to think about Appalachia from the perspective of counter-narrative and to directly speak to existing stereotypes of the region. However, participants don't have to hold to these questions, and I've gotten submissions covering everything from family histories to like funny stories that have been handed down between generations. And I wouldn't say that these sorts of stories necessarily function as counter-narratives by themselves, but I did decide to include them because I think that just having more media out there in the world that's made by Appalachians and allows them to speak for themselves is still something good and a step in the right direction. In November of 2020, I decided to introduce another way for people to participate, which I've called the Appalachian Talkback series. Basically what I do is every Monday, I post a question on social media, and you can see an example here on the left, that I would then ask people to answer in the comments. And I've covered a lot of different topics in the series, like media representation and the effects of stereotypes, so things like feeling pressured to code switch. And I would say that this series has actually been one of the more successful things that I've done in the project, because more people tend to participate because the barrier to entry is much lower because you're just commenting on a post rather than making a whole submission. And it's also much more pointed toward creating counter narratives and speaking directly to stereotypes rather than just hoping that people might submit that sort of content on their own. I'd also like to quickly talk about how I approached co-creation as a member of the community in Appalachia. I think the biggest impact that being Appalachian had on the way that I approached this project is that it was a huge influence on my decision to be as flexible and as hands-off as possible in the type of content that I received. Both through doing research for my thesis and also just growing up noticing the way that Appalachia was portrayed in media, I realized that the vast majority of popular media on Appalachia is created by people who didn't grow up there, who didn't really spend an extended amount of time there other than the time that it took to make their news report or their film, and who really didn't seem to understand the impact that they were having on the people that lived there. I also wasn't aware of many opportunities for Appalachian people to speak for themselves in any sort of media, no matter who had created it, without heavy involvement on the part of a director or an editor. So since COVID had made it so I would have to do this project online anyway, I wanted to use the affordances of the web to give as many people a chance to talk as possible, and I didn't want to get in the way of what they were saying. So that's ultimately why I decided to open up the project to any kind of topic, even if it wasn't exactly the kind of story that I was most interested in. And it's also why I only edited submissions for spelling and grammar, and I didn't make any other major changes because I really wanted each person to retain their own voice and their own agency in the way that they wanted to tell their story. Also, being from Appalachia allowed me to tap into pre-existing networks that I had when it came to things like borrowing equipment to make videos and finding the people to participate in my initial 5 videos. Actually, of the people who participated, of the 5 of them, I already knew 3 of them personally. The 4th was someone that my mom suggested I should talk to, and the 5th was just someone I kind of reached out to and they agreed to do it. But I think having this network already in place was really helpful, both in getting people to participate, but also in already knowing a lot about these people's stories. So I think that helped me ask better questions and really get to the heart of the issues that I wanted to talk about. And finally, being from Appalachia was really helpful in growing my audience. And I was also really blown away by the response that I got from the community. I mainly promoted my work through social media, and people were really excited about this work and they were really willing to share it. And they would also suggest people that I should reach out to and offer to help in other ways. And I really don't think that I would have gotten this response if I had been from somewhere else and was doing the same work, because there is definitely a distrust of outsiders in Appalachia. So I think people would have probably been wary of what my real intentions were. But on the flip side, there's also a very strong culture of support within Appalachia. So there's this sense that if one of us succeeds, that we all succeed. And I think that's also a big reason that people supported the project like they did, because it felt like a win for all of us. Now I'd like to move on to some of the counter narratives that have come out of the project. The first, and I think the most common narrative, is a celebration and a pride in Appalachian culture, history, and people. This is counter to a lot of popular media representations that tend to portray Appalachia as this place to be ashamed of or a place that needs to be escaped. But instead, people would talk about their love and their connection to Appalachia and the people who lived there, even if they did acknowledge that it had problems. The second counter narrative was highlighting the diversity of Appalachia, whether that's racial and ethnic diversity, religious diversity, or highlighting the experiences of women. This is counter to most popular portrayals of the region that show it as this completely white, male-dominated, and Christian place. And the final counter narrative is a direct speaking back or a critique of Appalachian media representation and of stereotypes in general. And a lot of people actually went on beyond just calling these stereotypes out, and they would go on to talk about the effects of stereotypes in their own lives and in their communities. So I'd like to finish with just a couple of conclusions from all of this. The first is the importance of thinking about director versus participant control in co-creative projects and the way that prioritizing one over the other can affect the outcome. I decided up front to make the Appalachian Retelling Project extremely participant driven. So my strongest involvement was really at the beginning in making the first 5 videos and in creating prompts and in continuing to engage with people on social media. But otherwise, I tried to let people use this project as a platform to say whatever it is that they want to say, and just for me to be the person who promotes it. And I've learned that this approach has both affordances and drawbacks. So some of the drawbacks are that since this project is so open-ended, a lot of the content that's on the website doesn't necessarily achieve my goal of creating counter narratives, at least by itself. A lot of people are just sending me like family histories or funny stories, and they're not thinking more deeply about whether or not they're trying to undermine stereotypes of Appalachia. And I think if I had been more involved in the process of them creating, I could have worked more with them to make them think about the topic in that way. But on the other hand, I've also received a lot of feedback that giving people this platform has been extremely empowering, even for people who don't end up submitting anything. Just knowing that this project exists and that they can participate if they choose to, and that I'm going to let them share whatever feels important to them, it really makes people feel empowered. And I think that is a positive result from this project. So I think it's important to consider if the goal is the final narrative itself, or if the goal is for the process of creating to be impactful. And that can kind of help you decide the balance of director versus participant. And another thing that I've realized through this work that's kind of interesting and that I hadn't really considered at first was the importance of being an insider versus an outsider when working in Appalachia. I don't mean to say that someone from outside Appalachia couldn't make a successful co-creative project in the region, but I do think that being able to say, hey, I'm from Pikeville, Kentucky, was really helpful in getting people to trust that I had good intentions. And people were just really excited to support another Appalachian who was doing this work. I've also realized that although I am from the region, I think I inhabit this sort of interesting middle space between inside and outside. Because I grew up there and I still claim myself as Appalachian, But I've also spent pretty much all of my adult life outside of the region and with people who tend to know very little about Appalachia other than what they see in the media. So I think as a media maker, this positioning allowed me to consider what I make both from the perspective of an insider and an outsider, and to think about how the same content might be read by these two different groups. And having that knowledge actually affected a lot of the decisions that I made throughout the project, from the topics of the original videos to even things as small as like the tone and the style of the website. So while I don't think that occupying this space is necessary to work with a group, I do think it was really helpful for me. And I think that it allowed me to come at this project from a sort of unique angle. And that's all I've got. Happy to take questions.
All right, so let's open it to questions. William.
So Elin, thanks very much. It's wonderful to see how this project has continued to grow. And I guess what I want to ask you about is a lot of your discussion, a lot of your framing was really about counter narratives, about the expressive side, people making texts that help to complicate the vision. But it strikes me that and that's a worthy and fine goal. But these acts are also in a way catalysts for a bigger discussion. And are there discussions coming out of this? Is there a way you're able to track that? In other words, there's the media artifact, and then there's kind of what goes into it, which is hard to know if you're not, as you said, with COVID and everything, it's hard to be there and be part of it. But there's also what comes after it. Is there a space for discussion? Is there a dialogic side to this where these are elements in like a catalyst for people thinking and talking and yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. So since this project is so social media reliant in some ways, it's actually kind of been one of the cool things about it is that I have been able to see a lot of the discussion that's been generated from my project. So I'll see people share it on Facebook or, on Twitter or whatever, and they will actually kind of add to the conversation in some way. And they might post about like an experience they've had in their own life with stereotypes. They might talk about, wow, we really do need to think about like how we're represented and try and change that. So I have seen some discussions happening about that after viewing my work. I feel like there was more to your question.
No, it's really just in your conceptualization of it. That platform enables it for sure, but it strikes me that using these as ways to sort of crystallize and provoke discussion that's where change often happens. And I'm just wondering if you had social media is one way to capture that. I know you started with the website. I'm not sure if that, are there, you talked about partnering, any organizations you're working with that might, like platforms like newspapers or churches or community groups or anything like that?
Yeah. So throughout the month of March, actually, I partnered with a news organization based out of West Virginia called 100 Days in Appalachia, and they have a monthly newsletter series that people will sign up for, and they'll get the weekly newsletter in their inbox. So I took over their March newsletter, and I really used that to share mainly what I talk about in the first chapter of my thesis. So I break down like the 4 different stereotypes each week. And then in addition to that, I would share some of the posts that I had gotten on my website that kind of fit into maybe a counter narrative for each particular trope. And then finally, I would post a series of prompts at the bottom and try to get people to submit more content to my project. But I think partnering with 100 Days was really great. I enjoyed it a lot. And I got a big response from it, surprisingly. People would actually just reach out to me, and they would try to put me in contact with other, I was put in contact with other journalists who were kind of interested in this topic. I was put in contact with academics who were doing work in this space. So yeah, I think it's been great.
I don't know why I'm up there 2 times, but I'm getting an echo. Can you hear me?
I can. You're echoing.
I don't know what to do, but I'm so impressed with the work But anyway, I can't ask.
You could post it in the chat maybe, and I can read it.
Let me see what, I'm gonna leave and come back in.
Maybe I can answer, Scott.
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
No, it's no echo?
you're good.
One of you left, Ken. One of you left. The other one is still here. And it sounds
Thank you. What a wonderful subject. I mean, I'm just excited because it really goes to the heart of my kind of thinking. First, I have so many questions. First, I want to know what did the WPA do in this area? I mean, have you looked at the earlier work of the WPA around similar sorts of issues?
Yeah. So I do remember reading a little bit about like the TVA. I don't know if you're kind of thinking like the same thing. Yeah, honestly.
I mean, culturally, I mean, you know, for example, in the Black community, you had people making recordings of, you know, of stories and so forth. And I think there were similar sorts of projects as part of the WPA in the 30s now. And that would be a good sort of connection as well.
Yeah.
But I think, I look at programs like the Waltons, and I'm very interested in the way this country has chosen to portray poor whites in general, but especially in Appalachia and certain parts of the Carolinas and so forth and so on, and all of the social and political implications, behind that, and how, your attention on sort of the Black community in Appalachia is very important because there is one there. People don't want to talk about it, and it's just such an exciting topic, and you're doing the right thing in getting the stories that these people have, because they will be lost if we don't get them. But more importantly, I'm interested now in the whole issue of infrastructure and broadband. I mean, what you're doing really does raise the question of, what is the internet going to be like in these various communities that are not connected if there isn't some kind of attention to bringing, broadband throughout all of these rural communities and so forth. Have you thought about things like that as well?
Yeah, and it's interesting when you see it all kind of laid out, because I actually do write about it a little bit more in my thesis. But it's interesting to see how these kinds of things like build upon one another. So I learned that when the national highway system was built, it was actually, they were instructed to avoid mountains. So that essentially cuts off Appalachia from the rest of the country that has now become much more interconnected. And so when people can't get in and out of the region, you can't export, you can't really connect with other economies, you can't grow. And so I think, things like that are the reason that we don't have broadband. I think that they all kind of compile.
Yeah, and then you right now you have the political situation with Joe Manchin really being the most important so-called Democrat right now, sort of representing West Virginia, which is, totally Republican, and how people have, sort of played these things against each other. This country has traditionally, used Appalachia and other poor white communities in the most insidious ways, and to promote its own racism, trying to turn them as being racist, when in fact the racism is not from them, but it's from the outside and the kinds of things that you just said. So I hope that in these projects, people will begin to see how they have been used by the, by the white power structure to promote racial animosity at this very low level. And it happens not only in Appalachia, but in, in poor communities in the South and other places as well. But anyway, I really applaud you for your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Scott, you had your hand up a moment ago, and
yeah, I'll be quick, but happy to. Wonderful work. I mean, it's really spectacular, and clearly there are so many places in which groups are othered by media, by media, and the powers that the power structures. Have you thought about deriving sort of principles that would be applicable sort of for other communities and other groups to also sort of change their representation?
You mean in creating new narratives, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think I maybe focus on it, or I talk about it a little more in my thesis, but since I am drawing upon Stuart Hall, that's kind of the way that I think about it. But he talks about how there are kind of three potential routes you could go about trying to create a new narrative of somebody. So one way is that you replace the stereotype with its inverse. So say that the stereotype is that Appalachia is poor, you just make a bunch of media about Appalachians that are wealthy. The next is that you try to reverse the stereotypes or reverse the negative into a positive. So you're saying that the thing that most people say is bad is good. So people say Appalachia is bad, we say Appalachia is good. The third is this idea of going inside the image and actually trying to contest these various stereotypes from within. So I think one great example that I talk about a lot in my thesis, it's a whole chapter in my thesis, that I didn't get to talk about today, is the film Hollow by Elaine McMillan Sheldon. And it's focused on a county of people in West Virginia. And it's all about like, what is home to you and how can you save your home if it's kind of dying. But they talk a lot about how they feel that they've been stereotyped as being like the poorest county in America, as having a horrible drug issue, and that, everyone that lives there is like hooked on pills and things like that. And it's so interesting to see that like they don't avoid these topics. They don't say, no, this isn't happening. They don't say, no, we're the best, we're like Appalachia is the greatest place to live in the world. They acknowledge these problems and they say that they love it anyway, that that's their home anyway, and that it matters. So I think that is the most effective way of going about trying to contest dominant representations, is to not ignore when these things are based in truth, but to say that even if they are, we matter anyway.
Thanks.
All right, Kat.
Thank you. Elin, congratulations, and thank you so much for inviting me into your process, and Vivek as well. It's been such an honor to witness your journey from the days that we met in Kentucky. So this is wonderful. And I see the mountain behind you there. And I just wanted to point out really one of my favorite quotes in your work is about the mountains, how there's the one mountain of the dominant narrative and the other mountain of the counter narrative, and then there's the space in between. And I guess that's the question I pose to you is, and you've opened up this space to actually talk about these sort of negative, positive, binary situations, director, participatory. You've set those out and laid them out clearly and offered people a chance to talk about that. And that's a really important part of the process. The next part is, it's a call and response. So what is the response for you as a director? How are you going to move forward in continuing to open up that space into a third space, a new space between those two very locked binaries?
Yeah, so that's something I've kind of been thinking a lot about lately, especially just in regards to the project, is like what is next, because I feel like now could be a fitting time to end it, but I also feel like there's a lot more that could be done in this space. So I think personally what I would do with the project is I would love to start actually working more with people on how to think about their stories. I think that I got some great stuff just by being very open about it. And I think I would still allow that. But I would love to like just get to learn more about people, like what people are doing and what people are talking about, and just reach out to them and say, hey, would you like to work with me and we can think about how to tell this story together. I think that, you know, it's like we've talked about how like it's not really a binary between participant control and director control. It's really a spectrum, and you need to think about where you fit on that spectrum and what's the most beneficial spot to be. And so I think that's kind of what I'm figuring out right now is where should I be on the spectrum? How much should I work with people? How much should I give them space to say what they want to say? So yeah.
There's one question actually quite related to this in the Q&A, and that is from Joshua Glick, and that is fascinating presentation. I love all the collaborative dimensions of the project. Are you thinking of synthesizing some of your research and aspects of the larger project into a long-form documentary, or are you leaning towards the co-creative process, continuing the co-creative process?
I think I lean more toward the co-creative process. I think that making long form films has just never been my area of interest. For one, I have a very short attention span. I think that's why I gravitate toward short form content. But I also think that it's just like, I don't want this to be some final like art, like thing. I can't think of the word. I don't want it to be some final thing that just never changes. I feel like this is something that can keep going on and that can keep expanding. So I think that's what I'm thinking about.
All right. Thanks so much, Elin.